Good morning and welcome to Church at Home with Rachael. This episode of Church at Home is scheduled to air on Monday, the 31st of January. I'm recording it on Thursday night, the 27th of January, because I am angry, I am appalled, and I needed to sort of talk this out. This week we had the, I believe it was yesterday, we had the recognition of Holocaust Remembrance Day. And, I acknowledged it. I noticed it on Facebook and got about my business. Never again am I going to pass over that day and not give it some time and some thought. I like watching a gentleman who does videos like this, only his are amazing. His name is Beau of the Fifth Column. He seems to be standing in his garage or something every day and talks about American politics and things that are going on. And he's a great speaker. He's very he's very intelligent. He has a great way of presenting arguments and walking us through things in a logical way that makes some sense. And I just watched a video of him talking about this book called Maus, M-A-U-S, which is German, written by an author called Art Spiegelman. It's a graphic novel. So like for those of us who are older than 30, that's like a comic book, only a book size. So it's pictures and words, and it's written about the Holocaust. And in it, the Nazis are cats and the Jews are mice. Hence the word mouse. And it's based on his family, his own family's experience of the Holocaust. I haven't read the book. I do plan on reading it. But apparently there's a school board in Tennessee that has taken it, is banning the book because it shouldn't be taught in the schools. Okay, I disagree. I can see why people would be upset about that in this climate we're in right now, especially in the States. Their arguments apparently are things like there is nudity. The author talks about a picture of his mother in the bathtub, and the picture's like this tiny, so you'd have to look really hard to notice that she's naked. The argument seems to be about the mouse. One of the mice is naked. And as Beau talked about, Daffy Duck, Donald Duck, have no pants on. So are we going to, banning Donald Duck from television screens and books because he's wearing no pants? Another thing is the language. He uses the word damn it. Beau mentions, he says, I wonder if we actually polled the children in that school, if they were asked what kind of language is used in your house and what kind of language is on your video screens and the video games and things like that damn it probably wouldn't be sufficient to say we should ban the book. But it's really getting into this idea about authoritarianism and what happens. How can a whole society, how can a whole country buy into this? How can a whole community, whole country, the population somehow come to believe that evil is correct and right and acceptable? And in Tennessee, there's a school board. One of the comments in both the comments, reading this on the comments, and somebody brought the point that the school board members are not educators, they're not teachers, they're elected members of society that sit on the school board. That's part of the problem. When we start stating that, that's offensive to us, something that is true and real is offensive to us, we have a problem. When we are banning a book because it is about the Holocaust, because essentially, deep down, that's probably what it's about. If we are banning a book because it tells the truth of what happened in the most horrific part of the 20th century, something that people, we should be saying can never happen again, and yet we're watching our society march closer and closer and closer to the edge of that abyss, where it might indeed happen again. That is not acceptable. We should be teaching these things in school. It's like the whole issue around Aboriginal studies. We didn't teach it. We ignored it. We pretended it didn't happen. And now we are faced with the catching up of non-Aboriginals in Canada with the truth about what happened and having to convince people that it did happen. bodies buried on the grounds of residential schools, regardless of how they died, even if they died of tuberculosis. Why were they buried in unmarked graves? Why did they have tuberculosis in the first place? Why were they not being treated? Why were their families not informed? Okay, the question becomes, why was that allowed to happen? And we're dealing with it 40, 50, 60, 100 years later. No, we cannot do that. We must face these problems. We must face these deep, dark, horrible, horrific truths, realities now, so that our children and grandchildren are never faced with having to deal with those. Because you know what? Regardless of who we are, what we look like, there is no guarantee that we won't be the ones that the other determines is wrong. For me, white people, we were the ones making those decisions. What happens if the tables are turned? We'd be screaming bloody murder, wouldn't we? Why wasn't this taught? How did our society get here? It got here because we let it. It got here because we stood back and said, it's not my problem. It's too hard a truth to deal with. I don't want to learn about that. I don't want my children taught about that. It's too brutal. My gentle children's ears can't handle that. Horse pucky. Hitler was real. The residential schools were real. We have literature, art, that helps us to deal with those things. Facing it, how many of us could handle going to Auschwitz? How many of us could go to one of those concentration camps and stand in the middle of it and listen to the stories and understand what really happened there, not even 100 years ago? How many of us could really do that and could handle it? But when we read about it in a book, or we see it in a painting, or in a movie, we're separated from it by a few degrees, and it allows us to learn. It allows us to experience it without experiencing it, and we can let it get into our heads and into our hearts, and we can start thinking critically about it. But if we remove the art, if we remove the chances for people to learn about it, to hear about it, where will we be? I remember being in grade 11 and being told, I was in grade 10, taking grade 11 English, and our teacher was teaching us, we were reading Huckleberry Finn. And it was really important to her that we read that year as Mrs. Marchese at Wesleyan High School. And she said it was important that we read it because in Niagara Falls they hadn't yet banned the book. But in a couple of boards of education over from us in the Niagara region, they had started the conversation to ban the book because of the N-word that was used to talk about Huck's friend. It was so many years ago I read it, I can't remember his name now. But you know who I mean. You know what I mean. The fact is, Mark Twain wrote it to shine a light on what was happening in society. He wrote it, and generations of people after it read it and are horrified by it, while not recognizing they're horrified because it's written in such a way that you're reading it and it hits you later. You're like, oh, yeah, okay, I get it. Mark Twain had an ability to be able to share something in a way that made people think, but if they were entertained and they learned something and they were reading a good book, and it's a classic now, and hey, oh yeah, and there's other stuff too. It's not just a great adventure story of a boy and his friend on a raft going down the river. It's a story about racism. It's a story about slavery. It's a story about lynching. It's a story about the homeless. It's a story that teaches us so many things. And when we start banning books like that, when we start banning books like Mouse, we do ourselves, at the minimum, a disservice. But what we've done is we've got that slippery slope. We've got that thin edge of the wedge that, well, that's not appropriate for our kids. We're going to say that. And the next thing is not going to be appropriate is teaching history. And the next thing that's not going to be appropriate is teaching the history that says, teaching the the skills that say think critically. Does this make sense? Why would this politician or this group of people or this power group or this corporation, why would they do that? What are the ramifications? What are the impacts? How does it impact my life? How does it impact society? How does it impact the climate? When we stop allowing people to learn how to think critically, we become lemmings. We will not be able to think. We will not be able to make decisions for ourselves. We will not be able to deal with anything except the consequences that our ignorance brings about. And then we'll be faced with consequences we have no idea how to deal with. Mouse should not be banned in Tennessee. Huck Finn should not be banned in Niagara Falls, Ontario. No book should be banned. We need to teach people to face the things that scare them, to think critically about them, have conversations about them, and then be able to say, do you want to read it again? If not, then don't. But telling them they should never read it is like telling someone don't bother to learn how to think. I'm not saying put Mouse in the hands of a 6-year-old, but I am saying put Mouse in the hands of a teenager with a teacher who can stand in front of them and say, okay, here's a history book. This is what really happened. Here's this book. What can we learn from it? How do you feel? How do you think a teenager in that era would have felt? How do you think a German teenager felt at that time? How do you think a Jewish teenager felt at that time? Would you like that to happen again? How do we make sure it doesn't? Because I don't know about you, but this Thursday night, I'm listening to all this news about a convoy heading for Ottawa, and one of the people that was filmed the other night and proudly put it up there on Facebook, and they had it on the news, he said, people don't have to die, but Canada needs to be brought to its bleep knees. Tell me that we're not already on a slippery slope. I'm hoping that by the time this airs, the convoy happened, everything was peaceful. People had their say, people had the right to protest, and that they did, and that they all went home gently, and nobody gets hurt. That is my prayer. Because in Canada, we have the right to protest. We have the right to disagree with our politicians. We have the right to make up our own minds, but we also have the right to educate ourselves. And we have the responsibility to educate ourselves. We have the responsibility to be civil to one another and to ensure that things like happened in the 20th century between residential schools and Holocausts and lynchings and all of the horrible things that have happened to the world, to our people, to our climate, we have the responsibility of using our rights to make sure they never happen. And part of that means we can't ban things like books, and we can't ban convoys, but we can ask that people use them responsibly. So the convoy needs to be responsible. Books need to be read responsibly. We need to be responsible to each other and for ourselves. And only when we all do that will we get to a place where we can have a conversation about why people are so scared that they would want to ban a book. Thanks for sticking with me for my rant. Have a good day. God bless you, and I'll see you tomorrow for Church at Home with Rachael.